So I'll be talking about process consulting. It's a peculiar type of consulting because I think we're used to the idea of a consultant who is an expert consultant, a subject matter expert, an expert in the field. And because that person is an expert in the field, if a client or anybody who would like to get some understanding about that field, okay, then it's easier for that person being a consultant to provide information or any answer or solution for that client because the consultant is an expert of that field. Now, helping clients by providing them with access to deep subject matter expertise is actually not the only value adding way of consulting. And this is where process consulting comes into the picture. Now, when we're talking about process consulting, okay, we're trying to differentiate an expert consultant versus a process consultant. Now, every activity involved in consulting can actually be split into two parts. The first part being the content of the activity or the subject matter of the activity, and the second part being the process of the activity. So you can look at this in simple terms, like the content answers the question what, and process answers the question how. So an expert consultant is actually focused on the content, but sometimes they get involved in the process somehow. And not just process as a whole, okay, but in the process of solving problems because they have the content that can actually lead to solutions. On the other hand, a process consultant looks exclusively at the process. Now, let's consider an example, a complex example, which is creating a requirement specification for a new IT application in any business. This is probably familiar to most of us doing IT work. Now, an expert consultant would approach it by number one, listing what they felt were relevant requirements for this type of application. And sometimes they might even tell the client what might be best for them in that situation. That's an expert consultant. And if you've noticed, this type of consultant, you'd see that the expert consultant didn't really listen to the client at the start, right? That can happen. Okay, maybe the situation or the landscape is clear cut, which would make the expert consultant competent to be able to come up with those recommendations, be more assertive or insisting on what the solution would be without involving the client's input at the start. On the other hand, a process consultant is so much more. A process consultant would help the client to define the requirements themselves by going through a process like the ones that we show in our screen right now. Okay, you identify the requirements in the first place. That's the first step. You interview, identify the requirements owners and agree, document requirements. Okay, you consolidate the requirements into a single list. You remove duplicate requirements. You identify conflicting requirements. You bring requirements owners together to resolve any conflicts. You agree to prioritize requirements according to the team's criteria, and so on and so forth. If you've noticed, in this particular process, the process consultant didn't really have any value as regards to the content or subject matter of what's being required. You'll notice that the process consultant didn't say anything on what the appropriate application or solution might be. Okay, they're involved in crafting the process, okay, and coming up eventually with a solution, okay, with the client. Now, you can probably look at this in similar to this comparison table in front of you. And there's a difference with how a process consultant would interact, okay, versus an expert consultant. Okay, you'll notice that the process consultant will always be encouraging, facilitating, supporting, coaching, exploring, involving. Whereas the expert consultant would be inquiring, analyzing, instructing, advising, showing, recommending. Okay. While we're not saying that these types of styles would be exclusive to one type of consultant, but you can already detect the predominant category of the consultant by the style of the interaction that's being involved. In fact, the consultant's client proposition would also differ. Like in the case of the process consultant, I will help you to solve your own problems. Versus an expert consultant, the proposition would be I will recommend what is best and show you how to do it. And you can already see that, okay, both types of consultants, they're needed by clients. They have a different approach on actually coming up with a solution. On one hand, the expert consultant, they know the solution and they'll give it to you right away. On the other hand, the process consultant doesn't know the solution right away, but they can actually create a system. They'll create a process, okay, and mechanics along the way to actually get you to the solution, to the problem that the client will be faced. Now, process consultants and facilitators, they provide the structure and focus to the process of discussing and resolving the problem eventually. But whether you're an expert consultant or a process consultant, you are still responsible for achieving an outcome. Now, in the case of process consulting, it's the client who maintains the ownership of the outcome that is accomplished. Okay? Hence, effective facilitation requires an understanding of the objective or outcome desired. This to manage the discussion and communication skills, as well as flexibility, responsiveness, and insight into the dynamics of the group that you're involved in. Now, the most common tool or means that a process consultant would have would be what is known as workshops. So, workshops are usually an important part in any process consulting engagement. The typical objective here is to determine how to overcome a problem or issue that a client wants to resolve. Okay? So, the workshop is the main method, the main tool that's at the disposal of a process consultant. Now, in typical workshops, especially at the beginning, the objective really is defined in terms of scoping a problem. So at the end of that workshop, what you really want to accomplish as far as process consulting goes is that you have come up with a scope of the problem that you really want to solve. You're not yet solving the problem then and there. And that said, you will understand that when you do process consulting, it's never just one shot or one move deal. It's never just one workshop. You'll probably have many activities, many workshops, many interviews, many roundtable discussions, and all of that is part of process consulting. Now, we said earlier that while the process consultant rather, focuses on the process of the discussion, but the solution maintains with the client, right? That the client still owns it. So how do we differentiate consulting from managing? So if you're a typical manager of an organization, I mean, what would be the difference between a manager and a consultant? Okay. So in this case, the manager, who is part of the client's organization, well, who defines the problem? Typically the manager. Who owns the problem resolution? It's the manager. Who defines the solution? It's the manager. And a manager would typically have the styles such as measuring, reviewing, and directing. You'd probably recall, let's say, the four parts of management, right? PLOC, no? So planning, organizing, controlling, okay, and leading. Okay, so that those are the typical activities of management that a manager would normally have. Now, but a consultant is not a manager. Okay, and why is that? And you can see here that in both cases, an expert consultant and a process consultant, the one who defines the problem is the client. Okay, and then the one who owns the problem resolution. Okay, in the case of the process consultant, it's still the client, and the one who defines the solution is still the client. However, for an expert consultant, when you go to the solution phase, it starts to overlap, right? Whoever owns the problem resolution, it could be the consultant, it can also be the client. It could be both. Who defines the solution? In the case of an expert consultant, It will always be the consultant. You're there, you're the expert, you provide the solution. And the typical interaction of an expert consultant would be okay, they gather the data, they analyze the advice. But the process consultant is a little bit different. They facilitate more, they structure conversations, they question, they try to build buy in. Okay. Now, and that's how it is. So sometimes you, you have to understand that when we do consulting, there's this temptation that the client would like you to be as if you're the manager. Okay. But that's not normally the case. And I think that it has been mentioned in other times wherein y- the consultant is not a manager, and it has to be maintained in that way that uh, you're a consultant, you're external to the organization, but you're there to help the organization. Now, what are the advantages of process consulting? There are some important reasons to select process consulting as opposed to expert consulting when we are looking at certain situations. The nature of process consulting is that a client or a client team goes through the process of scoping and solving a problem and is normally the primary participant in the consulting engagement. Okay, so the client is, or the client team is at the center of the process consulting endeavor. Okay, if the client or the client team does not have any buy-in, okay, then you'd expect the process consulting to have a little bit more difficulty in coming up with its completion. Okay. Now, process consulting can be beneficial for the client, even on a personal level. Why? Because it can result in greater acceptance of the outcome from an engagement. While we're saying that the client still owns the solution of the problem, okay, uh, if you're just simply going to shove it up their throats, right? Forcing it or becoming dictatorial, well, they'll probably be resistant. They may not even like the idea. Eventually, they'll let you implement something, but after a few days or weeks or months, the solution would fizzle out. Okay. But if you exercise process consulting, then you can be assured that the outcome of the engagement, whatever it is something that will be acceptable to the client. Now, process consulting can help the client to learn and understand more about an issue. Okay, you're helping them be educated about the issue at hand. So it's not something that the client is passive. You just simply receive information, okay, about all of it. Uh, you're there to actually learn and to understand other challenges regarding the issue at hand. Now, clients expect consultants to have expertise. Okay, that's in general, even if you're a process consultant. Uh, and that's the reason why you have consultants. The consultants are supposed to be advisors to them, oftentimes. But there are situations wherein it is not always appropriate to give advice, and there could be a lot of reasons. So sometimes the issue would be quite complex, that there's a lot of unknown information. And because there's uncertainty, then it doesn't make sense for the consultant to be an expert consultant, right? There might be things that an expert consultant may not know. And if an expert consultant tries to give a direct advice, then that could be wrong because of certain missing information. On the other hand, a process consultant helps the client go through that process, okay, and then go through that journey eventually. And then eventually the client would realize it after going through the journey that the solution is within the reach of that client. Okay. So it's not always the case that when you are engaged to do consulting for a client, that it is expected that you always have to give advice. However, do expect from time to time that you may be asked for advice. Okay, but it's not always going to be the case. And certainly if it is not something that you have full mastery over. Okay. Now, sometimes a better solution is for clients to solve the problems themselves. I wouldn't want to say sometimes, I mean, most of the time, I mean, if you can help them help themselves. Of course, you don't really want the client, in a certain sense, to solve the problems all the time because you would lose business as a consultant. Okay, but definitely, in terms of empowering your clients, that's something that you should be doing. Okay, and clients and client staff are often the best people to analyze the problems. They're there in the ground. They have better visibility of the situation. They have more data that's accessible to them. Okay, and with that advantage, it's easier for the clients to come up with their own solutions. Okay. Now, process consulting skills also can provide a way to help a client in situations in which you are not a subject matter expert, but you still want to contribute value. So just because you're a process consultant doesn't mean that you're useless or you're lesser of a consultant than perhaps an expert consultant. You're still consultants. It's just that your approach to solving the problem is different. Okay. It is common in many consulting engagements to find yourselves in unfamiliar situations. And this is the advantage of process consulting. You can navigate through a lot of uncertainties. Okay. And for as long as your process is legit, is really strong, then that's something that you can work on and make sure that you're going to help your client accomplish or arrive at a solution that is appropriate for them. Now, what are the disadvantages of process consulting? Okay. Well, being an expert consultant in itself is an advantage also because it can bring an unbiased view of situations. They can be independent about it. They don't have any incentive because they're not part of the organization, so they can give you an honest assessment of things. Okay. Process consulting, that's not the case because since process consulting can still be unbiased, the solution is really coming from the client. So there are a lot of biases or how do we say this, situations wherein they tend to have blinders, like in horses, wherein they're not circumspect about the situation. It's possible that the solution that can be crafted through process consulting would be limited because of the limitations of the biases that the solution might have. Unlike an expert consultant, the expert consultant is not part of the organization. And therefore, I mean, they can look at things in a dispassionate manner. They can tell you in black and white what is and what isn't. Okay, and just to give some example to that. Now, an expert can also help break what is known as groupthink. So, groupthink is that phenomenon where in a group everybody is thinking of the same thing at the same time, which is weird because it limits your solutions. You're not going to be innovative as well. And you run the risk that whatever solution you have is actually suboptimal. Now, critically, an expert can actually provide speed in identifying a solution. So if you're in a situation wherein you need to have a solution to an issue right away, sometimes you don't want to go through a process. You probably would want to engage an expert and let the expert tell you what to do already. So it saves up time. So that's the disadvantage of process consulting. Process consulting needs time because you have to go through a process. And because a lot of it requires buy-in from the client, it really, really is a difficult process to engage in only because of the time requirement. Now, if the issue is time sensitive, you need to come up with a solution right away, then it would be more appropriate for you to come up with an expert consultant for that particular issue. Now, what else can we look, okay, when it comes to process consulting and expert consulting? Of course, there's that question of when do you do process consulting, when do you do expert consulting? Well, there are several factors to consider before deciding which style of consulting is best. The first question might be, does the environment or culture of the client suit a process consulting or an expert consulting? Sometimes there are clients wherein they are expected to be results driven, so they might just simply would want, okay, what's the end game here, what needs to be done, so they're more suited to an expert consulting style. On the other hand, if the organization is highly affiliative, they care about the people very much, then process consulting might be a more appropriate style for that organization. Now, other factors to consider would be, um, how urgent do you need to have a resolution of the problem? Is it immediate? Okay. Or is it something that you still have time? Okay. Another factor would be the level of input and involvement a client can give to an engagement. Do you think the client would have a lot of say on what needs to be resolved in that particular moment? Okay. And the level of consensus. Are you just dealing with one person or two persons? Or are you dealing with a lot of people? Okay. So those are the things that you want to consider about an issue before deciding on what type of consulting would be best for that issue. Now, sometimes process consulting is used for whole engagements, and more often it is more powerful to use it in parts of an engagement. So you can have engagements that's purely process consulting. Okay, and you're there because you're asked to do a workshop, and then you'd help the client come up with a solution, or some sort of a position paper, for example. Okay, that's the entire engagement. But then process consulting can be done in certain parts of an engagement. In some cases, you'll do process consulting, but in other cases, you'll probably do expert consulting. So it's a mix. You can actually do that. Now, process consulting is more appropriate in some stages of the change process of the client. Now, the change process, because you're expected to get some buy-in from the client. And we know that in those situations, process consulting is the better approach. Okay. It's so hard to have people adapt to a change if you're just going to be instructive or you're just going to be directive and not really engaging them as a whole, convincing them, trying to persuade them, which is something that is more apt in process consulting. Now, another factor to consider in selecting the preferred consulting approach is your own capabilities. Maybe you're not an expert in that field, so all the more you shouldn't be doing expert consulting. On the other hand, if you're the type who's maybe an expert in one area and you'd like to, try to still get the buy-in of that person based on your expertise, then you still need to do some process consulting as well. Now, these are a lot of things that we consider when we're trying to decide which type of consulting to use. And to wrap up and conclude this particular section on process consulting, I'd like to talk about a little bit of collusion. Okay, collusion refers to the consultant collaborating with the client, so much so that you are already ignoring on what might be good for the client just because you want to do what the client wants. And that's typical. We often hear of cases or anecdotes wherein this is what the customer wants, but later on you realize this is not what the customer needs. So if you fall to that situation wherein you just do what the client tells you to do, well, that's not really consulting. Okay, that's tantamount to collusion. And whether you're a process consultant or an expert consultant, you should still be independent of the client. And as much as possible, you want to uh, keep that neutrality whenever you're dealing with a client by avoiding collusion with them. Now, one related example of collusion would be sometimes the clients would like to wash their hands. They don't want to be responsible for anything and they just hand it over to a consultant. They would even argue that's the reason why you're there. You're being paid to do consulting so that you can, do the things that we couldn't do. We'll just forget about it. We'll hand it over to you. Just tell us what needs to be done. Okay, you do it, and that's it. Okay. I think it's worse. I mean, it's one thing to say, you tell us what needs to be done. It's another thing to say, you think about it and you do it. Okay. In that sense, that's not a consultant. You're probably are requiring a contractor or a supplier in cases, but that's not a consultant. Okay. And as a consultant, well, if you really want to maintain the integrity of the consulting profession, you want to make sure that you're still independent with the client as regards issue resolutions.